The old machine had not made a sound in 40,000 years. It sat in the lower vaults of the Vareth archive on the planet Versh Prime, behind 3 locked doors and one warning sign that most younger archivists no longer took seriously. Archivist Talm had taken it seriously his entire life. He had spent 50 years studying the machine, reading everything the Vareth had ever recorded about it, and concluding, after all that careful, patient work, that he still did not fully understand it. He understood it better the night the Drath came. The Drath Dominion did not announce their arrival. There were no negotiations, no final warnings, no formal declarations. One moment the orbital sensors around Versh Prime were showing empty space. The next moment they were showing warships, hundreds of them, arranged in the kind of tight, disciplined formation that the Drath used when they were not interested in talking. The Vareth defense fleet scrambled. Their commanders sent emergency signals to neighboring systems. They prepared every weapon they had. It was not enough. Everyone watching knew immediately that it was not enough. The Drath ships did not fire all at once. They fired in sequences, rotating through their fleet in a slow and methodical pattern that stripped away the Vareth defenses piece by piece. It was not a battle so much as a process. The Drath had done this before, 11 times by recorded history, and they were very good at it. In the lower vaults of the archive, Talm felt the building shake around him. Dust fell from the ceiling. One of the old lamps flickered out and did not come back on. He stood in the half-dark with his hands folded in front of him, listening to the sounds of a war being lost above his head, and he thought about the machine. He had no authority to activate it. He was an archivist, not a military officer, not a member of the High Council. He was a very old man who had spent his life reading about things that no longer existed. The machine behind the 3 locked doors was a relic of the Veil, a species gone so long that even their name was only known because they had carved it into their own ruins. The Veil had built the machine and left it here, and they had left behind exactly one instruction, carved into the stone above the door. Talm had translated it himself, years ago. He had translated it 12 more times after that, because he had not believed the first result. It said, for the moment when you need help you cannot ask for, use this. Someone will hear it. He had spent decades wondering who they meant. What kind of species would hear a signal like that? Whether the machine even still worked after 40,000 years of silence. The building shook again. This time something in the floors above cracked loudly. Talm heard running feet through the ceiling, the sounds of his colleagues evacuating the archive, taking with them whatever records they could carry. He walked to the first door and unlocked it. The machine was not large. That had always surprised him. It was a box, roughly made of a dark material that the Vareth had never been able to fully analyze. It had no visible buttons or controls. There was only a single indentation on the top surface, the exact shape and size of an open hand. Talm had placed his hand there many times over the years carefully, without pressing, just to see what it felt like. He placed his hand there now and pressed down. The machine made a sound like a held breath being released. A single tone, very low, felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. Then nothing. The machine sat quiet again. No lights, no display, no confirmation of any kind that it had done anything at all. Talm removed his hand, locked the door behind him, and went upstairs to help carry the records. 12 light-years away, in a direction the Vareth had no name for, something in the dark of space moved. It was not a ship. It was not a station. It was a signal, thin as a thread and old as the stars around it, passing through the void in every direction at once. It did not care about distance. It did not care about the speed of light, which had always been a rule rather than a hard limit for the Veil, who had long since found the gaps around it. The signal moved through those gaps the way water moves through soil, invisible and unstoppable. It reached the edges of human-monitored space, 6 hours after Talm pressed his hand to the machine. The monitoring station above Europa was a quiet post. The officer on duty that night was a communications technician named Bren, a methodical, unhurried person who had spent 4 years on the station and had developed the ability to read sensor data while half asleep. She was not half asleep when the signal arrived. She was fully awake, eating the last of her cold dinner, and she nearly knocked it off the console when the alert tone sounded. The signal was not like anything in her reference library. It was not static. It was not a natural phenomenon. It repeated at perfect intervals, and inside the repetition there was structure, a kind of deep mathematical grammar that her translation systems could not parse but could clearly identify as intentional. Something had made this. Something had wanted it to be heard. She flagged it immediately and sent it up the chain. Within 2 hours, 3 separate analysis teams on Earth were looking at it. Within 6 hours, the signal had been confirmed as artificial, non-human in origin, and consistent with a distress format across 7 different analytical frameworks. Within 20 hours, the heads of Earth's Space Command were in a room together, listening to a recording of the signal played through speakers, and one of them said what they were all thinking. That is someone asking for help. The debate that followed was not long. There were those who argued for caution, for probes, for further analysis before committing any resources. There were others who argued that if it was a distress call, every hour spent in debate was an hour the sender did not have. The second group won, not because they were louder, but because they were right and everyone in the room knew it. Admiral Dara Solis was given the command within 48 hours of the signal's arrival. She was handed a fleet of 14 warships, 2 medical vessels, and a diplomatic cruiser. She was given a set of coordinates derived from the signal's origin point and a single standing order that was really more of a permission than an instruction. Go, see what is happening, and use your judgment. She stood in the briefing room where they gave her the orders, and she looked at the coordinates on the display above the table. The number of light years involved was not comfortable. The total picture of what might be waiting at the other end was unknown. Her entire intelligence briefing on the origin point was 3 paragraphs long, and the most useful sentence in it was, "We do not know." She asked one question before accepting the command: "How fast can the fleet be ready?" They told her 72 hours. She said, "Make it 60." The fleet departed on the 58th hour. 15 ships in formation, moving toward coordinates in a direction that had no name on any human chart. On the bridge of the flagship, Soli stood at the viewport and looked at the stars going past. Around her, her crew ran their checks and called their numbers to each other in the routine language of a ship preparing for faster-than-light travel. She did not know what she was flying toward. She knew someone had asked for help. She knew she was going. That was enough. Behind her, the fleet stretched out in formation, and ahead of them, getting closer by the hour, was whatever had made that sound in the dark. The Drath frigate captain was writing his victory report when the humans arrived. He had gotten as far as the 3rd paragraph, the part where he described the collapse of the Varith Eastern Defense Line in precise and flattering detail, when his sensor officer made a sound that no officer under his command had ever made before. It was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when they see something that their brain is not ready to process. The captain looked up from his report. On the display above the sensor console, 15 ships had appeared from nowhere at the edge of the engagement zone, not from a jump point, not from any calculated approach vector. They had simply come out of faster-than-light travel and stopped, and the way they stopped was wrong. Drath ships decelerated in smooth, calculated curves. These ships stopped hard, like they had hit something solid, and then they just sat there, engines running, reading the battlefield. The captain had never seen ships like them. They were large, heavily armored, and ugly in a way that suggested whoever built them had cared more about function than form. Their hulls were thick and uneven, covered in external plating that looked almost improvised. They had too many weapons mounted in too many places, as though someone had kept adding guns to them until they ran out of room. He sent one signal to those ships: a standard Drath territorial warning, ordering them to leave or be fired upon. They did not leave. He fired. On the bridge of the human flagship, Lieutenant Aachen Briggs watched the Drath warning shots hit the forward shields and called out the impact readings with the focused calm of a person who had trained for this moment so many times that his body ran on muscle memory alone. Around him, the bridge crew moved through their emergency protocols without being told. Shields redistributed, weapons powered up, navigation plotted options. At the center of it all, Admiral Soley stood with her hands behind her back and looked at the tactical display showing the full scope of what they had arrived into. It was worse than the briefing had suggested. The engagement zone was massive. The Vareth fleet, what remained of it, had been pushed back into a tight cluster around the planet. There were debris fields where ships used to be. The Drath formation was enormous, disciplined, and clearly in the middle of finishing something they had started some time ago. Soley studied the display for 9 seconds. Aachen counted, not because he was bored, but because in those 9 seconds the Drath fired 2 more volleys, and he needed something to focus on that was not the incoming fire. Then she said, "Move us between the Vareth cluster and the Drath forward line. Formation anchor, all ships." Formation anchor meant no advance, no retreat. It meant planting the fleet in one position and absorbing whatever came. It was not a tactic designed for winning fights. It was a tactic designed for stopping them. Every captain in the human fleet received the order at the same moment. Every one of them executed it without question. 14 warships and 2 medical vessels moved in a coordinated spread that put human hulls between the Drath guns and the surviving Vareth ships. The Drath fired again, a full volley this time, not a warning. The human ships shook. Shield readings dropped across the board. 3 hull breach alerts opened on Aachen's console, and he was already routing repair teams before the last one appeared. The human fleet held position. On the Vareth command vessel, High Speaker Revan had stopped speaking mid-sentence. She had been in the middle of a transmission to her surviving commanders, laying out the order for a final defensive retreat to the planet's upper atmosphere when the new ships appeared. She recognized nothing about them. The hull design matched no species in the Vareth database. The formation behavior was unlike anything the Vareth tactical library described, and they had placed themselves between her fleet and the Drath guns with the casual ease of someone stepping in front of a slow-moving door. Her communications officer was already trying every frequency, every translation protocol the Vareth possessed. The new ships were broadcasting on multiple channels, something rhythmic and structured that the translation system was clearly trying and failing to decode. Beside her, Commander Sale pulled up the sensor readings on the new ships and stared at them. "They took 3 full Drath volleys," he said. "They are still at full power." Revan said nothing. She watched the display. "They are not attacking," Sale continued. "They are just standing there." "Someone sent that beacon," Archivist Talm said from the corner of the bridge where he had been standing quietly since the crew had stopped pretending he should be somewhere safer. "We activated the Veil device. These are the ones who answered." Sale turned to look at him. "You are saying that machine worked?" "I am saying," Talm replied, "that I always believed it would. I simply did not know what it would send us." Revan found her voice. "Open every channel. I want contact with those ships." It took 40 minutes to establish communication. The translation was imperfect, full of gaps and guesses, more approximation than true language. But the framework held. The human fleet's communication systems were advanced, adaptive, and apparently designed by people who had spent a great deal of time trying to talk to things they did not share a language with. The Vareth translation systems were ancient and thorough, and built on the Veil's own linguistic frameworks, which had been designed to bridge exactly this kind of gap. The voice that came through the channel was calm. Not forced calm, the kind that covers panic, but the kind that comes from a person who has already decided what they are doing and is no longer afraid of it. This is Admiral Solis of the Earth Fleet. We received a signal. We came to help. Tell us what you need. Revan looked at Talm. Talm looked at the ceiling. Sale looked at the sensor display, where the Drath fleet was holding position, doing something it almost never did in the middle of an engagement. It was waiting. Why are the Drath not firing? Sale asked his sensor officer. The officer looked at the readings twice before answering. Unknown Variable Assessment Commander. They don't know what they're looking at. Standard Drath tactical protocol calls for a pause when an unknown force enters an engagement. Sale understood that. He understood it very well. He was doing the same thing. Revan opened the channel. Her voice was formal, steady, carefully controlled. Admiral Solis, I am High Speaker Revan of the Varith Collective. We are under attack by the Drath Dominion. Our fleet is damaged. Our planet is behind us. If you intend to help, I need to know what you can do and how long you can hold. The pause on the other side was short. We can hold as long as it takes. Start talking. Below decks on the flagship, Engineer Petra Voss was already doing 4 things at once. She had a hull breach on Deck 7 being patched by 2 crew members she was directing through her earpiece. She had a shield emitter on the port side running at 60%, that she was rerouting around manually from a service corridor. She had a junior engineer holding a component she needed who was standing in the wrong place, and she was explaining in very simple terms why he needed to move. And she was reading the incoming sensor data on the Drath formation with the half of her brain that was not occupied by the other 3 things. They were big ships, the Drath, well built. She could tell from the energy signatures alone. The weapons were high yield but not unusual. The formation was tight but predictable. She had already identified 3 structural patterns in how they were arranged that could be exploited if anyone wanted to. She filed that information away and went back to the shield emitter. Around her, the flagship continued to take hits. The ship shook and groaned and kept flying because it was built to keep flying, and because the people inside it were built to keep it flying, and because somewhere above her head, the Admiral had decided they were staying. Petra Voss had no objection to that. She just needed more time and slightly better materials. She would make do with what she had. That was what humans did. The Drath did not attack during the night cycle. They regrouped. They ran their own calculations. They sent messages back to their command authority that traveled a long way and would take time to come back. That gave everyone else approximately 19 hours. In those 19 hours, more happened than in the previous 2 days of fighting. Supply lines were reorganized. Damaged ships were assessed and, where possible, patched. The human fleet repositioned itself in a wider arc, covering more of the approach vectors that the Drath could use when they returned. And on a Varith diplomatic vessel that was commandeered for the purpose, High Speaker Revan met Admiral Solis face to face for the first time. The meeting room was small and slightly too warm for the humans and slightly too cold for the Varith. Neither side mentioned this. Archivist Tulm sat at the end of the table with a translation device he had modified himself, adding his own notes and contextual guides to every language module it contained. He had been preparing for this conversation, or one like it, for most of his life. His hands were steady. His eyes were bright. For a very old archivist in the middle of a war, he seemed in excellent spirits. Revan entered the room and stopped when she saw Solis. The Admiral was not what she had expected, though she was not entirely sure what she had expected. Something larger, perhaps, something louder. Everything she had absorbed about humanity in the past 19 hours suggested a species that operated at significant volume. Solis was quiet and still, with the kind of face that had learned to give very little away. They sat across the table from each other. Tulm began translating. Revan opened with a formal Varith greeting, which was long, precise, and expressed the full weight of the collective's gratitude in terms that required 11 separate grammatical constructions to convey properly. Solis listened. When it was translated, she said, "Thank you. What do you need from us right now?" Talm translated. Revan looked at the Admiral for a moment. Then she began to talk in earnest. She described the Drath Dominion clearly and without embellishment, the way a military leader described an enemy. 11 civilizations absorbed, 2 years of advancing on the Varith's outer systems before reaching the home world. The Varith defense fleet had been fighting and losing ground the whole time. The Council had sent requests to other civilizations in the sector. None had responded. The Varith were, as of this week, alone. Solis listened to all of it. When Revan stopped speaking, Solis asked one question. "How many of your people are still alive on the planet?" Revan told her. The number was large. The kind of large that is difficult to hold in one thought. Several billion people below them on the surface, going about the business of surviving a war that had already reached their sky. Solis looked at the table for a moment, then she looked up. "We came with 14 warships and 2 medical vessels. We are not enough to push the Drath back, but I sent a full report to Earth the moment we arrived in the system. Reinforcements are being assembled. They will need time to reach us." She paused. "We will hold until they get here." Revan did not answer immediately. She studied the human across the table in the same careful way she studied all difficult problems, with full attention and no assumptions. "Admiral," she said at last, through Talm's translation, "the Drath fleet outnumbers yours, significantly. What you are describing is not a military strategy. It is a decision to stand in front of something very large and refuse to move." "Yes," Solis said. "That is not how wars are won." "Sometimes it is," Solis replied. "And sometimes winning is not what you're trying to do. Sometimes you are just trying to make sure certain things do not happen. The people on that planet do not get to be absorbed into the Drath Dominion. That is the thing I am trying to make sure does not happen. Everything else is details." Talm translated this and then added quietly in Varith, the thing he had been thinking since the humans arrived. "I believe them." Revan said nothing more for a long moment. Then she moved on to the tactical briefing, because there was a great deal of work to be done, and the time they had was not going to last. In a separate room on a different deck, Akin and Sale were not getting along, which was its own kind of progress. They had been placed in the same tactical planning room, because the combined fleet needed a coordinated defensive strategy, and the 2 officers most suited to building it were Akin on the human side and Sale on the Varith side. Nobody had asked either of them if they wanted to spend their limited preparation time in a small room with someone from a species they had never met before. Nobody had needed to. It was the obvious assignment, and they both knew it. The problem was that they disagreed about almost everything. Varith tactical doctrine was built on order and precision. Ships in their correct positions, every firing angle calculated in advance, no action taken without a clear assessment of risk. It had served the Varith well for centuries in smaller engagements. Against the Drath, who were disciplined enough to exploit any predictable pattern, it had not served them well at all. Akin looked at the Varith defensive plans and said so. He said it plainly and with complete confidence, which was the only way he knew how to say things. Sale told him, also plainly, that he had no right to criticize a military tradition he had not studied. Akin agreed that this was probably true and then explained why the plans needed to change anyway, using the sensor data from the last 3 days of Drath engagement patterns as his evidence. He laid it out point by point on the shared display, showing every moment where Varith tactical predictability had cost them a ship, and then showing what a different choice at each moment might have produced. Sale did not agree with him, but Sale was a professional, and when someone showed him evidence, he looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he started asking questions. Not arguing, asking. The kind of questions that mean someone is thinking. By the third hour they were arguing again, but it was a different kind of arguing. The kind where both people are working toward the same answer and disagreeing about which route to take. By the fifth hour they had a plan. It was not a purely human plan or a purely Varath plan. It had the structured positioning of Varath doctrine as its skeleton and the deliberate unpredictability of human tactics threaded through it. It looked strange on the display. Neither of them was entirely happy with it, which Aachen privately considered a good sign. He said as much. Sale looked at him with the careful, measuring expression he had worn since they first met and said, "Humans are very strange." "Probably," Aachen said. "Does the plan work?" Sale looked at the display again. "I think it might." "Then we're fine." Below the waterline of the flagship's lower decks, Petra Voss was watching two Varath engineers try to understand a human power coupling, and feeling the particular frustration of a person who knows exactly what needs to happen and cannot explain it because they do not share a language. The Varath engineering team had come aboard to help patch the hull damage using their own materials, which were lighter and faster to work with than the human equivalents. The problem was integration. Varath materials interfaced with Varath systems. Human ships were, in places, held together with solutions that made perfect sense to engineers who had grown up improvising, and made no sense at all to engineers who had been trained in precision. Petra tried diagrams. She tried demonstration. She tried pointing very specifically at the component she needed, and then at the place she needed it to go. The Varath engineers watched everything she did with complete focus and then showed each other diagrams on their own devices, clearly discussing the human ship's infrastructure with something between confusion and professional alarm. Then the older of the two Varath engineers picked up the coupling Petra needed, turned it in her hands for a moment, and fitted it into place with a modification Petra had never seen before and would need to write up later, because it worked better than the original. They looked at each other, no shared language, no translation device, a functional repair. Petra nodded. The Varath engineer did not nod back because nodding was not something the Varath did, but she made a gesture that the translation notes would later describe as the closest Varath equivalent. They moved to the next section. The ship was not fixed. It was not going to be fixed before the Drath came back, but it was going to hold together a little better than it had an hour ago, and that was the only goal that mattered right now. Solis sent her full tactical report to Earth late in the night cycle. She described the situation in exact terms. She described the Varath. She described the Drath fleet, its size and its positioning and its pattern of behavior. She described what she believed would happen when the Drath finished their reassessment and came back. At the end of the report she added one line, not because it was standard procedure, but because she felt it needed to be said. "We will hold. Send the fleet when it is ready." She did not say please. She did not say hurry. She knew Earth well enough to know that neither word would make any difference. Either the fleet would come or it would not. Either they would hold long enough for it to arrive or they would not. She turned off the transmission, looked at the planet hanging below the ship, and thought about the billions of people down there who did not know that their fate was currently in the hands of a species they had only just learned existed. Then she went back to work. The Drath would not wait forever. It started with sound. Not the sound of weapons, but the sound of every alert system on every ship in the combined fleet going off at the same moment. A wall of noise that was immediately drowned out by the visual on every display. The Drath fleet moving, all of it, at once, coming forward in a formation so wide it stretched across the entire upper quadrant of the engagement zone. Aachen had been at his console for 18 hours straight. He had slept for 2 of those hours, sitting in his chair, and he had not slept well. When the alert sounded, he was already running through his checklists, already talking to the fleet relay officers, already doing 3 things simultaneously because 3 things needed to be done. The plan he and Sail had built together activated. The human ships did not meet the Drath advance in a straight line. They moved in pairs, rotating through positions in a way that looked from the outside like organized chaos. Every human ship was always moving, never holding the same angle for more than 90 seconds, crossing through each other's firing lanes in patterns that the Drath targeting systems had to constantly recalculate. The Vareth ships held the structured core, anchored and disciplined, giving the human ships something stable to orbit around. The first hour of the battle was brutal and roughly even, which was more than anyone had expected. The second hour was harder. The Drath adapted. They always adapted. It was one of the things that had made them unstoppable across 11 civilizations. They broke their own formation into smaller groups and began running interference patterns that caught human ships when they crossed firing lanes. 3 human vessels took severe damage within 20 minutes. Aachen rerouted. He pulled ships from positions that felt important and moved them to positions that were actually important, sacrificing sensor coverage for weapon range, giving up ground that could be recaptured later for ground that could not be recaptured at all. Sail was at a secondary console on the same deck, linked to the Vareth fleet's command channel. Twice in the second hour he and Aachen shouted at each other across the room, not in anger, but because the noise level had climbed and neither of them had time to be polite. Both times they resolved the disagreement in under 30 seconds because both of them were arguing about tactics, not about each other. The flagship took a direct hit on the port side in the middle of the second hour, not a glancing blow. A direct hit from a Drath heavy rail weapon that punched through the outer plating and into the deck below the bridge. The ship lurched. Consoles flickered. 3 people on the bridge were thrown off their feet. Aachen was not one of them. He had gripped his console at the first sign of the incoming shot, some instinct operating faster than conscious thought, and he held on while the ship screamed around him. Then the ship steadied, not because the damage had stopped, but because Petra Voss, 7 decks below, had already rerouted the power systems in a way that kept the engines and weapons online while she sealed the breach. She had done it in 4 minutes. The engineering logs would later show it should have taken 22 minutes under standard procedure. Standard procedure was a suggestion. Petra Voss moved faster than suggestions. The third hour was when the Drath changed strategy. It happened without warning. The Drath forward fleet pulled back suddenly, and the heavy assault ships, the ones that had been hanging at the rear of the formation, began to move, not toward the human and Vareth fleet, toward the planet. Aachen saw it first. He called it out before the alert system caught it, because he had been watching the Drath rear formation and had noticed the change in their engine signatures 3 seconds before they moved. "They're going for the surface," he said. The room went very quiet. Solis was already on the channel to the fleet. She did not raise her voice. She gave the new positions in the flat, clear tone of someone who had prepared for this possibility, because she had. The 2 medical vessels that had been holding in the middle of the formation moved. They dropped toward the upper atmosphere of Versh Prime, taking station at the curve of the planet, becoming a second line between the Drath heavy ships and the planet below. 2 medical vessels against Drath heavy assault ships was not a fair fight by any measure. Solis sent 4 of her warships with them. Aachen watched the numbers and said nothing. He knew what the math looked like. Taking 4 ships from the main engagement to cover the planet meant the human fleet in the primary line was now thin in places it could not afford to be thin. He recalculated. He found positions that could cover 2 weak points instead of 1. The coverage was worse. It was what they had. He made it work. Sail was rerouting orders to 3 Vareth commanders when the hull breach hit his deck. It was not a direct strike. A Drath torpedo had caught one of the Vareth ships in the formation, and the debris field had struck the flagship in the process. A section of corridor on the same deck as the tactical room depressurized in under 6 seconds. The emergency doors sealed. The alarm announced it. Sale looked up from his console, registered the situation, and went back to his routing. Then the emergency door between the tactical room and the damaged corridor showed a fault on the display. Not sealed, partially sealed. Enough to hold for now, maybe, but the pressure difference was increasing. Akin looked at the fault, then at Sale. "We need to move." Sale did not look up. "I am in the middle of coordinating a fleet withdrawal maneuver." "You can do that from the secondary tactical room." "This is the primary tactical room." "Sale," Akin's voice was level, "the door is not going to hold." Sale finished the coordination order he was halfway through, stood up in one motion, and moved toward the corridor. He was fast about it. Akin was right behind him. They were 4 steps from the secondary room when the emergency door failed, and the corridor behind them turned into a wind tunnel. The decompression lasted 2 seconds before the next set of doors sealed and contained it. In those 2 seconds, both of them were thrown forward. Akin caught the door frame. Sale did not catch anything. He hit the far wall of the corridor and came down wrong on one arm, and the sound it made was not good. Akin pulled him up and through the door. "Medical," he said. Sale said, "I am fine." "You are not fine. I can still coordinate." "You can coordinate from the medical bay. Move." Sale moved, because the arm was, in fact, not fine, and he was a practical person who understood that an injured limb was a liability he could not afford. He also moved because Akin's hand was on his shoulder, and the human was walking him there whether he agreed or not, and Sale was in too much pain to object effectively. Akin left him in the medical bay, waited for the confirmation that it was not life-threatening, and went back to the tactical room. He was back at his console in 7 minutes. The battle had not paused for him. It did not pause for anyone. The 3rd day of fighting was the worst. The draft had settled into a sustained assault pattern that was designed not to break the line immediately but to exhaust it. They rotated their ships in and out of engagement, keeping fresh weapons against tired defenders. The human fleet had no rotation. What was there was what was there, and it had been fighting for 60 continuous hours. They lost 2 ships on the 3rd day. The Vareth lost 2 more. Each loss hurt not just in the tactical sense but in the deeper sense of people not coming back. Akin knew the ship commanders of the 2 human vessels. He had eaten meals with them. He noted their loss in the way a soldier notes loss in the middle of a fight, which is to say he noted it and kept moving, and he would carry it later. The draft-heavy ships at the planet's edge had not broken through. The 4 human warships and 2 medical vessels holding the planet were taking damage that was becoming critical. Petra Voss was running a remote triage on 3 of them from the flagship, talking 4 different engineering teams through patches via the communication channel, doing the impossible at a slightly reduced speed because the distance made it harder. Soli stood at the viewport on the bridge for a long stretch of the 3rd day. She watched the engagement and she thought and she said very little. Occasionally she gave an order. Occasionally she changed a position or authorized a maneuver. Mostly she watched the engagement zone the way someone watches a thing they have committed to and will not walk back from, no matter what it costs. On the 61st hour of the battle, the Drath made their final push. Everything came forward. The entire fleet, all of it, full advance. It was the kind of move that ends engagements. The Drath had done it 11 times before against 11 different civilizations, and it had worked every time. The human and Vareth fleet did not break. They compressed. They fell back into a tight formation around the planet, everything in close, every weapon firing, every shield at maximum. It was not elegant. It looked, from the outside, like a group of ships refusing to accept the reality of the situation. And then, at the edge of the system's sensor range, 40 new signals appeared. Not Drath signals, not Vareth signals. Human signals. 40 Earth warships, carrier class, arriving from faster-than-light travel with the specific, coordinated precision of a fleet that had been traveling hard and was ready to fight. Their formation coming out of jump was already in attack posture. They had been briefed on the engagement zone before arrival. They knew exactly where to go. The Drath warlord regent had spent his entire career studying the mathematics of conquest. He understood odds. He understood when a battle changed and when it did not. He looked at 40 fresh human warships added to a human and Vareth combined force that had held against his entire fleet for 3 days without breaking, and he did the mathematics. The mathematics were clear. He gave the order to withdraw. He gave it quietly, without drama, because he was a professional. His fleet pulled back in the same disciplined formation it had arrived in, moving toward the edge of the system. They did not retreat in panic. They moved like an army that intended to come back. In the tactical room on the flagship, Aachen watched the Drath fleet withdraw on the display and said nothing for a long time. Around him, other crew members were making sounds, relief coming out in different ways at different volumes. He watched the sensor readings until the last Drath ship cleared the system boundary and their signatures dropped below detection range. Then he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. 3 days. They had held 3 days. It had been enough. After 3 days of war, the quiet felt like a different kind of noise. The human fleet stayed in formation around the planet. Ships ran damage assessments. Medical teams moved from vessel to vessel. Engineers patched what could be patched and documented what could not. The Vareth fleet did the same, moving slowly through the debris field that had once been the outer edge of their defense line, recovering what could be recovered, marking what could not. From the surface of Versh Prime, in the cities that had watched the battle through the clouds, the Vareth people sent one continuous signal upward. It was not a message in the traditional sense. It was a sound, a low communal tone that the Vareth used to express the things that words were not sufficient for. Archivist Talm, who heard it through the ship's receivers, explained to the humans nearby that the closest translation was something like, "We are still here, and we know." Solis heard this translation and said nothing. She filed it in the part of herself that would understand it later, when there was time. Revan requested a meeting 3 hours after the Drath withdrawal was confirmed. She came aboard the human flagship for the first time, which was itself a significant thing by Vareth protocol. The High Speaker did not go to others. Others came to the High Speaker. Revan had been making exceptions to protocol for 3 days, and she was going to make one more. She walked through the flagship's corridors with 2 of her staff and Archivist Talm, who moved with the careful pace of a very old man who had no intention of hurrying and saw no reason to start. The human ship confused him and fascinated him in equal measure. Everything was slightly wrong. The corridors were too wide and too blunt. The surfaces were covered in labels and warning markings and small utility fixtures that the Vareth would have kept hidden inside the walls. The whole ship felt, from the inside, like the inside of something that worked extremely hard and did not care how it looked while doing it. He liked it. The meeting room was the same small room they had used before. Solis was already there when Revan entered, along with Aachen, who had not slept since the battle ended and showed it only in the faint shadows under his eyes. He sat at the corner of the table with a data pad and the careful stillness of someone whose body was tired, but whose mind had not received that message yet. Revan performed the full Vareth ceremony of formal gratitude. It was 23 minutes long. The humans sat through it in complete silence, which was one of the requirements. Solis did not shift in her chair. Aachen did not look at his data pad. They both understood, without being told explicitly, that this was important in a way that required their full and quiet attention, and they gave it. When it was done, Revan looked at Solis and spoke in the direct way she had adopted for conversations with humans, because she had learned quickly that humans responded better to directness than to formal circumlocution. "I have been trying to understand," she said through Talm's translation, "why you came." We received the signal, Solis said. Yes, but that is a description of what happened, not why. Revan folded her hands on the table. The Varith Collective sent requests to 11 other civilizations in this sector over the course of 2 years. We explained our situation. We described the draft threat. We asked for support. None of those civilizations responded. Several did not answer at all. She paused. We did not know your species existed until 3 days ago. You received one signal. You sent 14 warships. You stayed for 3 days against a force that should have broken you. I need to understand what drives this. Solis considered the question in the way she considered all difficult questions, directly and without flinching. When someone asks for help, she said, you help them. That is the reason. Talm translated. Revan studied the Admiral. That is not a strategic calculation. No, Solis agreed, it is not. It is not a diplomatic protocol. No, it is not in your material interest. We did not come for our material interest. Revan was quiet for a moment. In all the years she had led the Varith Collective, in all the difficult negotiations and political crises she had navigated, she had become very good at reading the motivations behind statements. She searched the Admiral's face and found nothing she recognized as concealment. No second layer. No hidden weight. The statement appeared to be what it appeared to be. She looked at Talm. He raised his eyes from his translation device and met her gaze, and in the private language of people who have worked together for a very long time, he confirmed what she was thinking. The humans meant it, simply and completely. They had come because someone asked. There was nothing else. Revan looked back at Solis. My people do not fully understand your people, she said. I am not sure we are capable of fully understanding your people, but I will tell you this, Admiral. Whatever the Veil built that beacon for, whatever species they believed would answer it, I think they had yours in mind. Solis received this with a nod. Then she asked if they could move to the tactical briefing, because the Drath were not gone, only absent, and there were things that needed to be planned. Revan, for the first time in 3 days, almost smiled. In the Vareth medical facility on the surface of Versh Prime, Sale sat in a recovery room with his arm in a Vareth brace, and ate the worst meal he could remember eating in his military career. The food was human. Akin had brought it, carrying it from the shuttle in a container that had kept it warm, which was the only positive thing Sale could say about it. The flavors were wrong. The texture was deeply wrong. He ate it because refusing a gift from someone who had walked you to the medical bay with a decompressing corridor behind you was poor manners in any culture. Akin sat across from him, eating his own portion with complete contentment, apparently experiencing none of Sale's difficulties. How is the arm? Akin said. It will recover, Sale said. How is your head? Akin touched the bandage above his left ear, which he had acquired at some point during the 3rd day and had not mentioned to anyone. It will recover. They ate for a moment in silence. The plan worked, Sale said. Most of it. Enough of it. Yes, Akin agreed, enough of it. Sale looked at the human across from him. He had spent his whole career making assessments of people, reading their reliability and their limits. He had been doing it to Akin since the moment they were placed in the same tactical room. And he had been doing it with the specific focus of someone who needed to know if this human could be relied on in a crisis. He had his answer. He had gotten it somewhere in the middle of the 2nd day of battle. You are a competent officer, he said. Akin looked up from his food. Thank you. I did not say it as a compliment. I said it as an assessment. I know, Akin said. It still sounded like a compliment. Sale made the Varith gesture that Akin had learned meant something between exasperation and reluctant amusement. He went back to eating the human food, which did not improve. Talm found Solis alone in a small observation room off the main corridor, late in the ship's night cycle. She was not doing anything in particular. She was sitting in front of the viewport looking at the planet below, and the debris field that surrounded it, the scattered remains of ships that had once been flying and were not anymore. He knocked at the frame because the door was open. She turned and saw him and gestured at the other seat. He sat. He placed a data device on the surface between them. "I want to give you something," he said through the translation unit at his collar. "Records. Everything the Vareth archive holds on the veil and the beacon we activated. The history of it. What the veil believed it was for. What they believed about the kind of species that would answer it." Solis looked at the device. What did they believe? Tom settled back in his chair with the ease of a man who had told long stories his whole life and was comfortable with them. The Veil were gone before any current species existed, but they left records. They were, by what we can understand, a very old civilization. They had seen many others rise and fall. They observed something that they called in their own language the silence of the capable. He paused. It means the moment in any species' history when they have the ability to help but choose not to. When fear or self-interest or the simple effort of it stops them from moving towards someone else's crisis. The Veil believed this was the most dangerous moment a civilization could experience, not for the ones suffering, for the ones who chose silence. Solis listened. "They built the beacon," Talm continued, "because they wanted to give any suffering species a voice that could cut through that silence, but they built it with a specific frequency, one that only registers for civilizations in which the instinct to help has not yet gone quiet." He looked at her. "We activated it and the signal reached your species. No one else. 11 others in range. None of them picked it up." Solis was quiet for a long moment, or they picked it up and chose not to answer. "Possibly," Talm said. "The Veil did not specify. They simply built the thing and trusted that someone would be listening." He tapped the data device gently. "I think they trusted something very specific. I think they built it for you." Solis picked up the device and looked at it. Below the ship, Versh Prime turned slowly in the dark, lit on one side by its star, dark on the other. "We should sleep," she said. "There is a lot of work tomorrow." Talm stood. "There always is," he said, and left her there with the records of a species dead for 40,000 years who had looked forward through all that time and decided that someone worth building for was still coming. She stayed at the viewport a little longer, then she went to sleep. Tomorrow there was a war to figure out. Tonight, for a few hours that could wait. Deep in the Drath Dominion's command territory, a document was being read very carefully by people who had never been asked to read anything carefully before. The Drath Warlord Regent had filed his battle report within hours of the withdrawal from the Versh system. He was a methodical commander, and he did not falsify reports, not because of any particular ethical conviction, but because inaccurate information was tactically useless, and he valued accuracy above most things. His report described every hour of the engagement in precise detail. It described the human fleet's capabilities. It described their tactics. It described the specific things that had made the engagement go differently than every engagement the Drath had fought before. Then it described something the Drath had no good category for. He had not known how to write it as a military observation, so he had written it as a fact. The humans had been contacted by a species they did not know existed. They had traveled an enormous distance. They had arrived in the middle of a fight that was not theirs. They had placed their ships between a fleet and a planet, absorbed damage that should have destroyed them, held position for 3 continuous days, and not once, in all the sensor data and intercepted communications of that entire engagement, had they asked what they were going to receive in return. The Warlord Regent had conquered 11 civilizations. He had studied every species that the Drath had ever encountered. He had a library of behavioral models that predicted how species acted under pressure. Not one of those models produced the behavior he had observed. The humans did not match any existing category. They were not brave in the way that desperate species were brave, fighting because they had no choice. They had chosen this fight from a distance. They had brought it to themselves deliberately. The assessment in the final paragraph of his report was short. It said, "We do not know what this species is. We do not know how to predict what they will do next. Until we know, further action against the Versh system or any system they have claimed interest in would be inadvisable." The Drath ruling body read this paragraph 3 times. They had never received a report like it. They debated it. They disagreed about it. Some believed it was overcaution from a commander who had lost an engagement for the first time in his career. Others looked at the sensor data he had attached and were quiet for a long time. In the end, they did what they always did with problems that did not fit their existing understanding. They paused. They did not stop. They pulled their advance lines back one system, and they gathered more information, and they waited for something they could make sense of. It was the first time in the Drath Dominion's recorded history that they had paused for any reason. In the months that followed the Battle of Versh, the galactic community moved in ways it had not moved in decades. 3 civilizations sent formal diplomatic contact to Earth within 6 weeks. None of them were civilizations Earth had spoken to before. 2 of them were civilizations Earth had not known existed. They had all watched the battle on long-range sensors from a careful distance, and what they had seen had changed some calculation in them that had previously been settled. The Varith Collective formalized their alliance with Earth in a ceremony on the surface of Versh Prime, in the great public square of their capital, with Revan and Soli standing side by side under an open sky. Solis wore her dress uniform. Revan wore the formal vestments of the High Speaker, which were elaborate and ancient, and which she wore with the ease of someone who had worn them for a long time. Archivist Tulm stood to one side and translated, though by that point the translator systems were good enough that he was mostly present as a witness rather than a necessity. Akin was in the crowd, standing near the back with his arm in a sling because he had broken 2 fingers during the 3rd day of the battle, in a way he had not mentioned to anyone until after it was over. He was watching the ceremony with the look of a person who found formal occasions slightly tedious, but understood why they were important. Sale was standing beside him. This was not planned. Sale had come down to the surface for the diplomatic proceedings, which were relevant to his command duties, and he had encountered Akin in the crowd in the way that people who have been through something together encounter each other afterward, with a quiet recognition that did not need to be explained to anyone else. They watched the ceremony together without talking much. When it was done, they went and found food, because the reception afterward had food that neither of them recognized, and they were both, under the formal surface, hungry. The Varith food was strange to Akin. He ate it without complaint. The human food that someone had laid out on the other end of the table was strange to Sale. He approached it with visible suspicion and then ate it anyway. "Better than last time," he said. "The last time was in a medical bay in the middle of a battle," Akin said. "Everything is better than that." "True," Sale allowed. He ate another piece of whatever the human thing was. "You are being promoted." Akin looked at him. "How do you know that?" "I heard the Admiral speaking to the fleet commander from Earth this morning. They mentioned your name and your current rank, and then they mentioned a different rank." "It is strange that you were listening to that." "It is strange that I was listening," Sale agreed, without any particular embarrassment. "You will accept it." Akin thought about it for a moment. "Yes." Sale nodded. "Good. You are competent. You should be given more responsibility." He said this in the same flat assessment tone he had used in the medical bay weeks ago. Akin received it the same way he had then, as the version of warmth that Sale was capable of expressing in public with any efficiency. "What about you?" Akin said. "I am returning to my fleet. There is restructuring happening. The surviving Varith commanders and the human reinforcement fleet are working out a combined patrol system for the sector." He looked across the square at the platform where the signing ceremony had taken place. "It will be complicated. The 2 militaries do not think the same way." No, Aachen agreed, but we managed the tactical room. We managed the tactical room, Sale said. He was quiet for a moment. That is probably a good sign. They ate the rest of the reception food without ceremony and then went their separate ways, because there was work to be done. Petra Voss received her commendation in a room with 40 other people, which was more people than she preferred to be in a room with. The presentation was short. The medal was heavy. The speech that accompanied it was longer than she thought it needed to be, but she stood still for the whole thing because it was important to the people saying it, and she was not inconsiderate about that kind of thing. She gave her own speech in response. It was 4 sentences long. She thanked the commendation board, credited her engineering team by name, said one true thing about what the flagship's survival had really depended on, and stopped. Then she went back to the ship. She had a full systems review to run, and 3 modifications she wanted to make to the portside shield emitter routing while the ship was at rest, and she finally had the time. She had been thinking about those modifications since the second day of the battle. Now she could actually do them. Tulm deactivated the beacon on a quiet afternoon in the lower vaults of the archive, in the same room where he had activated it, with no one else present because no one else needed to be there. He placed his hand on the surface. The machine had been running a low, continuous tone since he activated it, something below the range of hearing but present in the walls, in the floor, in the materials of the room itself. He felt it now with his palm, the faintest vibration. He pressed, the tone stopped. The room was completely silent. After weeks in and around ships and battles and diplomatic proceedings, and the constant noise of a civilization reassembling itself, the silence was enormous. Tulm stood with his hand on the machine for a while. 40,000 years this thing had waited. It had been built by people who were gone before the Vareth learned to write, by a civilization that had looked forward through all of time and decided that someone good enough was still coming and deserved a way to call for help when they needed it. They had been right. The calculation they had made, impossible and patient and ancient, had been correct. He removed his hand. He closed the door and locked it. He left the warning sign where it was, because it was respectful to leave it, and also because the next archivist who read it should know what was behind that door even if they would never need to use it. He went upstairs. There was a great deal of history to write. Solis received her new orders aboard the flagship, sitting at the desk in her quarters with the door closed and the orders on the screen in front of her. She read them twice. The Earth Admiralty was forming the Outer Sector Fleet. It was not a symbolic posting. It was a real fleet, with real ships, real crew, and a mandate that covered the sector around Versh Prime and the new allied civilizations that had made contact in the months since the battle. The fleet's stated purpose was simple: to be present, to be the thing in the sector that everyone who needed help could call. Solis was offered the command. She did not deliberate for long. She sent her acceptance within the hour, stated her conditions in the clear and reasonable way she stated all things, and requested 3 days to complete the current diplomatic proceedings before reporting to the fleet assembly point. She was given 5 days, she used 4. On the day she took formal command of the Outer Sector Fleet, she walked its length at the assembly point. 48 ships, a mix of human warships and the first 3 Vareth vessels formally assigned to the joint fleet. The Vareth ships were elegant and precise, and they flew in exact formation beside the human ships, which were large and armored and decorated in the various ways that the crews of each ship had decorated them. Stickers and painted names and small unofficial modifications that the regulations technically prohibited and practically tolerated. She stood on the bridge of her flagship and looked at the fleet around her. The sector ahead was not safe. The Drath had paused, not stopped. The new alliances were real but new, untested under the kind of pressure that would eventually come. There were civilizations out there that had watched the Battle of Versh and were waiting to see if what they had seen was a pattern or an event. There were things ahead that she could not yet see. She gave the order to move. The fleet moved 48 ships in the dark, some of them human and some of them not, all of them going in the same direction. Behind them, Versh Prime continued its slow turn in the light of its star. The debris field was mostly cleared now. The orbital platforms were being rebuilt. The planet below was doing what planets did after wars, continuing because that was what living things did, they continued. Ahead, the sector waited. Something in it was going to happen. Something always was. Solis looked at the stars ahead and felt the ship move beneath her and thought about an old machine in a vault, built by people who had long since turned to dust, who had looked forward through all that silence and built something that said, "When you need help, use this. Someone will come." She thought about what it meant to be the someone. Then she went to work. There was a great deal of it. There always was, and she had never minded that. The fleet moved on. The stars moved past. In the dark between them, something that had started as an accident, a signal sent without knowing where it would go, a fleet sent without knowing what it would find, had become something else entirely. It had become a beginning.